the lesson for today is going to be we're going to be talking about poking. Poking is a very important part of Tekken. Poking, yeah. So we'll be getting started here. All right. Sorry we're a few minutes late, but yeah. So, anyways. All right. Poking. What is poking? Poking is using relatively fast and safe moves to frustrate and open up your opponent. So, some quick examples of poking, you know, like I play Nina a lot, so she does a lot of pokes, like down forward 1, down 4. Down forward 1, 2, down back 3, down 2. They're all relatively fast moves that are relatively safe. But for example, like her, this is not a poke. It's a launcher. It's launch punishable. This is also not a poke. It is minus 13, but it's slow and kind of linear. So doesn't really cover a whole lot of options. But yeah, so depending on the situation, sometimes slower or less safe moves can actually be used as pokes. For example, like a move that is punishable up close but has significant range, making it difficult to punish. So for example, like Nina's forward 3 is minus 14. But as you can see, it connects from pretty far out. And at tip range, a lot of people have a hard time punishing it. So sometimes I'll use it to poke people at a significant range. It's also 16 frames, which is a little bit slow for a poke, but because of the range, it works out. And also a move that is slow but has significant range, making it difficult to interrupt with a faster move. So it's kind of like the same one I was just talking about, but this one is actually safe. Like for example, Jin. Jin's got his forward 4 move, which is a really long range move. It can be used as a poke and can transition to his stance, and from the stance he can cancel it and become safe. So that's like a really good long range poke. It's good for keep out, counter hit launcher, safe, good for getting in. If it hits, he gets a mix up. So those are some examples of moves that don't necessarily fit the typical mold of a poke, but can be used as a poke because they fall into a specific situation. Right. And you want your pokes to be safe because you're going to be using them a lot. And if you use an unsafe move a lot, you'll get punished a lot. So the lows tend to be punishable, but that's okay because they're what you use to make your opponent to want to duck or try to deal with them. All right, so what poking is used for? The main reason why you use pokes is to significantly limit your opponent's options in their offense. So, contrary to popular belief, you don't use pokes to get damage. You know what I mean? Look at this. That's 7 points of damage. It's a little tiny amount of damage. It would take 20 down 4s would get 140 damage, which is not enough to kill. Down forward 1, it's more damaging. It's 14. So, yeah. But I mean, you're not gonna. You can kill someone with just pokes, but that's not the primary reason. The minor damage that they receive from the pokes is there to make them have to deal with them, basically. But what you really want to do is you want to limit their offense. Like for example, if your opponent blocks a generic 1, if they block a generic 1, they're at -1. And then if you follow up with a generic down forward one, there's which is 13 frames. They've got a 12 frame gap in there. So they if they try to attack, they can only use 10, 11, or 12 frame moves. They'll trade with the 12 frame move, and they will, but they'll lose to they'll win with the 10 or 11 frame move. But 10 or 11 frame moves are jabs and magic fours. That's pretty much it. Might be a few other ones, so they don't track at all. But yeah, so if they do anything slower, they get hit. Like to show an example, we're gonna have Jin. We're gonna record him. He's gonna do 1 to down forward 1. Right? So I can interrupt with a jab. I can interrupt with magic 4. Oh wow, that's traded. I can interrupt with magic 4, but if I do a 12 frame move, we'll trade. If I do a 13 frame, I lose. So right there, that limits the moves that I can do to 2 moves, basically. All the rest of my moves are off the table. Can't use them. So that's really limiting. Yeah, the only other thing I can do would be to try a sidestep or backdash, use movement, or some sort of evasive tool. So another way you limit your opponent's options is opponent blocks a generic down forward 1. They're at +1, and you follow up with a generic down 4, a I-12 low that high crushes, so 12 frame low that high crushes. If they do any highs, they'll get hit. If they do any mid or low slower than 13 frames, they will get counter hit. If they step to their left, they still may get hit, but if they step to the right, generic down 4s track pretty well. So this effectively reduces their options to either 12 or 13 frame mids or lows, blocking low, low parrying, or low crushing, or trying to step. But the stepping is usually beaten out by a generic down 4. So that really limits what they can do. I would show you this, but Jin doesn't have. I guess I can switch characters. But Jin doesn't have a generic down 4.
Welcome to the King, Nina Williams, Anna Williams. Get ready for the next battle.
Alright. So while this is loading, let's see here. Alright. So my record. So we were doing down forward, 1 into down 4, right? Alright. So if we can see here, if I do a high, if I block that and I do a high, it gets beaten, I get hit. Can't do it. If I do a down forward 1, we trade. 13 frame mid, we trade. I can beat it with a down forward 4, which is a 12 frame mid. Or I can do my own down 4. But if I try to step, I'm getting hit. Sometimes you can step to the right, but as you can see, it's hard. So, really limits the options. So when you're doing your pokes, you want to look for pokes that cover multiple options, like that. Right. So the secondary reason why you poke, or second reason to poke, is to open up your opponent's defense by making them guess how to deal with it. So you take away their options, and then you make them guess which of their options are actual options, or are bad options, or are good options. So like as we went through a couple of situations where you had very few choices, and I went through all the bad options, or like most of the bad options. Yeah. So, but you have to keep them guessing. If you do the same setups over and over again, then they'll become obvious, and they'll know how to deal with it next time. So keep your opponent guessing. Let's see. Let's see here. Yeah, so low pokes can be used for getting some minor damage to your opponent, and can add up to a significant amount of damage over the course of a round. So, like as we saw before, low pokes, they don't necessarily do a lot of damage, but they do some damage, and they will add up over time. So your opponent will have to deal with them some way, shape, or form. Whether that's just not letting you do them, moving out of the way, or blocking them, they're gonna have to deal with them. Mid pokes can be useful to get your opponent to not want to try blocking. Or otherwise dealing with your low attacks. So, you've got your mids, they'll hit them if they try to block low. If they try to hop kick to get over your low, you'll float them. Depending on the mid. Some mids you can't get float combos off of, but you'll still hit them out of a hop kick with a mid. And mid pokes often will also track fairly well. To one side or the other, not necessarily both. So that covers that options too. So find out what moves you have that track to which sides. Those are things that you should know how to do. With Nina, she doesn't really have anything that tracks except for her homing moves. Her down forward one tracks little, and her down four tracks like a down four, but other than that, I gotta use this to stop people from stepping. Right. So, how to effectively poke. Since the main goal of poking is to limit your opponent's options, your poking choices should reflect that. So, like, for example, bad poking option would be like down forward one into a power crush, something like that. Sometimes that can be useful, but only if you've got a good read on your opponent. But all they have to do is block that; they can punish you. Or also doing just like the same move over and over again, especially when that doesn't limit their options too well. Like if you just jab over and over and over again. Yeah, they'll duck or sidestep it eventually. And it limits them from pressing buttons, but they've got everything else available to them. High crush moves, ducking, sidestepping, down fours. Alright, so successful poking strategy shouldn't be to damage the opponent. The damage will happen successfully if you're successfully poking. So, like, if you damage your opponent, that's just a bonus when you're poking. Don't make that your focus. So additionally, with successful poking, you can force them to make mistakes and whiff, giving you the opportunity for big damage and a whiff punish. Let's see here, what was she doing? She was doing that. So, like, say we've got her doing 2 down forward ones, which is sometimes a viable poking strategy. Wait, that was not this topic. I don't have a good way of showing this without 2 people using another controller. But basically, like, if you're poking, you want to also be moving as well. So if you poke and they block something, you sidestep their counter poke, you can launch them. Yeah, that's the idea. Or you can back dash back in. Yes. So as Tumbling Monk said, since you can't hear it in the video, you use movement while you're poking. Use movement to generate opportunities to get launches and damage your opponent, or to get free damage with punishing. That's exactly it. And that's where your damage is going to be. Is when you successfully punish them for attempting to retaliate. That's where you get your damage, not necessarily from the pokes themselves. But yeah, like I said before, you want to cover as many options with your pokes as possible. But like pokes like the down 4 are really good just because they cover so many options. I mean, they're a low, they're a high crush. It covers stepping both sides really well. It's fast. It's 12 frames. I mean, it's a really good move. Doesn't. If you play a character that doesn't have a generic down 4, then you've got to use something else. Okay, you play Lei, right? He doesn't have a generic down 4? What about down back 4? Oh, that's the big sweep. Okay. Down 3. Alright. But yeah, there's a few characters that don't have them. They're generic, but not everyone has them. Yeah. Alright, so so also you want to avoid try and avoid falling into patterns, since patterns make it easier for the opponent to effectively deal with your poking. So like if you always down forward 1, down 4, if you do that every time, they're gonna start low parrying you, hop kicking you, you know, whatever, and it's gonna hurt. So don't fall into patterns. Can you talk into the mic so that way the chat can hear you?
So like sometimes if it's like best, like after you land one poke, sometimes it's best to halt. Sometimes like stop right there and freeze.
Yeah. I was gonna get to that a bit later, but we can talk about that now. So that's staggering your offense. So once your opponent starts getting a feeling for your timing, like one of the things you can do is throw the timing out the window. So like a lot of times people will act as soon as they can, because that leaves the smallest window for opportunity. But against really good players, they might be able to have options for all your contingencies, like fuzzy guard something, or they have a good read on you, so that way they'll know what you're doing before you do. So a way to deal with that is, instead of going for the quickest attack possible, wait like 5 frames and then go for something. So like 5 frames is long enough so that if they tried to block, they might second guess, like low block, they might second guess and stand back up, because a lot of good players will just like flash duck for a few frames. Yeah, so if you delay, you also make them have to guess, like basically every frame, 60 times a second. They have to guess if you're going to do something, and that's one way of overloading their decision-making process.
Right.
But yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you, Steve. Let's see here. So you'll want to know what your options are to cover the opponent's options. You can't cover all the options with one of yours except in very rare circumstances. So what I mean by that is, like the basic options you got to worry about is, if they're blocking high or mid, blocking low, if they are going to do a tracking move to try to catch you stepping after a block, if they're going to do a fast poke, if they are stepping to the left, stepping to the right, if they're back dashing, if they're hitting buttons, high, mids, or lows. Those are all the basic options that you should have ideas on how to deal with. If you've got a situation where you don't have an option to deal with that, that's a problem. That's not a good situation to have. Now, there's always a way of dealing with an option. Sometimes the way of dealing with it is not as good as others. Like sometimes you have to like delay to realign, so then you can hit them when they're stepping. But yeah, but know what your options are to cover those basic options. You know, I mentioned that you can't have cover all the options with one options except in rare circumstances. So the rare circumstances are if you put them into such negative frames that like a fast mid poke that you have, they can't do anything about it. They can't step it, they can't do anything, they just gotta block it. So sometimes things like Dragonoff's running 2, I don't know if you can step at it down. I think you can actually step it down forward one after it's running 2. But you know, but things like that, put them into heavy negative frames. Right. So since you can't cover all the opponent's options with one option of yours, if you can find 2 options that cover all of them, then that's really strong for you. Because it means when you put them into your opponent into that situation, you just have to pick one or 2 things, one of 2 things. But your opponent still thinks he has all his options. He thinks he can sidestep left, sidestep right, backdash, block high, block mid, block low, hop kick or whatever. He thinks they've got that. So unless he knows the situation already, he's gonna have to try all his options to find out that you've got that. You know, these 2 options deal with pretty much all of his options. Yeah. So. You're not always going to have situations where 2 options will cover everything, but if you can find them, then that's really good. If you have a generic down 4, that will likely be one of the options because it covers so much. Still no one talking in chat? Okay, so like I said before, movement needs to be part of your poking strategy. Absolutely needs to be. Like I had said before, movement is how you'll punish your opponent for trying to counter poke. Since pokes tend to be linear and don't have a lot of tracking, you can usually get around them one way or the other, if not both ways. And movement can also be useful for regaining frame advantage after a block poke that leaves you negative. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, if Anna blocks my down forward 1, Anna blocks my down forward 1, I'm at -1. No longer have frame advantage. But if she tries to capitalize on that minor frame advantage and jab me back because I can't interrupt it, I sidestep, then that's a whiff on her. So then I can use that to counteract, to deal with getting into negative frames. And you can usually effectively step up to -4 or 5 depending on the situation. Sometimes you can, if their opponent is doing a really slow move, you can step when you're worse. But it's not recommended to try stepping when you're worse than -5. Yeah, so let's see here. And then so vary your timing on your pokes. If you always use them in the same timing between a mid-low poke mix-up, your opponent has to make just one guess. We talked about this a bit earlier because of Steve brought it up early. So if you wait 5 frames during your mix-up, they'll have to make the initial mid-low guess plus an additional guess on whether or not you're going to do something, and then a guess each few frames on whether you're doing something. And once they have to start guessing, if you're going to do something, they basically have to. I just said that. All right. I should read ahead. All right. So, how to deal with an opponent's poking? So, since poking is a large part of the game, you're going to have to deal with your opponent poking. The biggest thing in dealing with the opponent's poking is patience. Don't let the poking get you frustrated. Because when you're frustrated, you start hitting buttons, try to get counterattacks, and then that's when they sidestep you and launch you. Also, when you're frustrated, you stop thinking as much. So, be patient. if you're getting hit by highs or mids, so like down forward ones, jabs, fours, whatever, if you're getting hit by those, then you are most likely negative. Therefore, you're limiting your options. So you'll want to just block. You'll likely just want to block, depending on the situation. But blocking is a good option, just that way you can start getting the frames back. And once you start getting your frames back, then you can try to find the gaps in their offense. So eventually, there's going to have to be a gap in their offense that you can exploit, because there's no completely seamless offense. There's weaknesses to everything. But so some potential gaps you can look for, like a 10 to 14 frame window you can sneak an attack in. So like I was showing before, if you were doing the down forward 1 to 4, you've got 12 frame, 10 or 11 frames in there to sneak an attack in. If you're doing 1 to down forward 2, that's a +1 jab to a 15 frame move. You would have 13 frames to interrupt. Yeah, so things like that. There's going to be some places where you can fit a fast poke of your own. Another gap would be to duck a high. If they're jabbing you a lot, sometimes you can duck it or high crush it. You can also block a low or a low crush. So if they do the down forward 1 into down 4, you can block the low or do like a hot kick or something. And then you can also sidestep or sidewalk a poke. So if they're just poking at you, like I said before, a lot of the pokes are fairly linear, so you can get around them by sidestepping. Let's see here, did I? Yeah, I showed you could sidestep out of the pokes, so I don't need to show it again. Yeah, so those are some of the potential gaps that you can exploit in your opponent's offense. Some of the main ones, but you can always look for others, like especially if your character has evasive moves, like they can lay down through some things, go into back turn, it avoids a lot of stuff. Some people have backswing blows they can use, or reversals. They cover different options, or there's a bunch of different options that you can use. Do some research and ask questions. Alright, so the next thing to do with dealing with your opponent's poking is to look for patterns in their offense. Even though you can try to not have any patterns in your offense, you likely will, and your opponent will too. So look for those patterns. Some common patterns include like a fast mid poke into a low, a fast high crushing low, like down forward 1 to down 4. That's a common pattern. A fast mid poke into another one, like down forward 1 into down forward 1. And then another one to look for is a fast mid poke into a sidestep. So down forward 1 sidestep. You'll see me do this all the time. All the time. That's just because it's so good. So a good player will vary up their patterns a lot, so you'd have to kind of guess which one they're going to do. But sometimes you can find that they like to do the same things in the same situations every time, and you can exploit that. But also keep in mind that the better players will also change how they follow up based on whether or not an attack hit, whiffed, or is blocked. So like a good player will see if it's hit and change up what they're doing. So if it hits, they'll keep going. When it blocks, they will they'll do movement. So that's another thing to keep aware of, is that a lot of players have modifiers on their patterns, making them slightly more complex but still patterns. So oftentimes the players will have like a big, long branching path of options that they do. That's often called a flowchart. And it's very useful for knowing what your options are, but you don't want to stick to it every time because then you're just following a complicated pattern, and if someone plays you enough, they'll figure it out. Yeah, so that is the lesson on poking. Is there any questions? Any questions? Alright, we got a question here from Crazy Max.
I apologize if you already covered this, because there's a few parts I missed. So at the end of a round, does philosophy on poking change? Because obviously you only need maybe one hit to kill. Something along those lines. And how would you go about poking at the end of the round when you're just trying to get a kill?
Alright, so poking at the end of the round. The philosophy doesn't actually change, but the implementation usually does. Yeah, because, and it also depends on the skill level of the players you're going up against. So like when I'm playing up against Bravo, and he's got like a down forward kill him, I will almost never use a down 4 because he knows that, and he'll low parry me. So I'll just use a bunch of mids. I mean, I will burn like 15 seconds just poking him with mids to see if I can catch him with something. And then I might eventually go for a low. But also at the end of the round, you also have to keep in mind at the time. So if your opponent if you have more health than your opponent and there's 5 seconds left, you could just run away. You don't even need to touch him. And you might be able to force him into a situation where he has no chance of winning. Like, for example, if you go with lay can lay down, that limits what they can do to hit you. They can't launch you unless you're Eliza, but that's beside the point. That's character-specific stuff, but most characters can't launch you when you're laid on the ground. So it significantly reduces the amount of damage they can do in a short period of time. So that's one way that the poking meta changes at the end of the round. Does that answer your question? All right. But generally the philosophy will always be the same with poking. Find the gaps, try not to go into patterns. So that one actually would be a pattern to look for is at the end of the round, does your opponent like to go low? A lot of players do. It's a pretty common one. All right, but anyways, that will wrap it up for this lesson. Thank you all for watching. We'll get this up onto YouTube later, and we're gonna get some death matches started. So.